The first red flag was the welcome basket. I had just bought 3 acres of wooded land at the edge of a sleepy town in North Carolina, planning to build my retirement cabin in peace. No neighbors in sight, no traffic, just trees and quiet. So when a woman in a pastel cardigan strutted up my gravel driveway carrying a basket of muffins and a clipboard, I knew something was off. "Hi there. I'm Tricia," she chirped, with that tight-lipped grin only middle-aged HOA board members seem to perfect. "I'm the president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association." I eyed her warily and leaned against the tailgate of my truck. "That's so? I didn't know there was an HOA here." "There wasn't," she said, pushing the basket into my hands. "But last year we voted to expand the Maple Hollow boundaries. Your new property falls under our jurisdiction now. You'll need to sign these and pay the initial fee." She slapped a thick packet of papers onto the tailgate. I didn't even bother flipping through them. "I don't think so," I said. "My deed says nothing about an HOA." Tricia's smile faltered. "Well, we're a governing body now and we filed the expansion with the county. You're in, whether you like it or not." I almost laughed. "Almost? Lady, I didn't buy into a neighborhood, I bought land. There's one road in and out and no one plows it but me. So unless your HOA plans to pave my driveway and build my house, you can keep your muffins." Tricia's face darkened, and her eyes narrowed behind those oversized sunglasses. "Refusing to join is a violation," she said. "We'll start fining you if you don't comply." I stared at her like she'd just threatened to fine a bear for living in the woods. "You do that," I said, "and I'll let my lawyer know." She gave a little huff and turned on her heel, stomping back to her Lexus that was parked half in the ditch. I watched her peel out, flinging gravel with her tires. I thought that would be the end of it. Spoiler, it wasn't. 2 days later, I got a letter taped to my mailbox post. Not mailed, taped. It had the HOA's letterhead and some ridiculous claim that I owed them $500 in fines for non-compliance and unauthorized exterior conditions. I hadn't even built the house yet. I called up my buddy, my lawyer Mark. He sounded amused when I told him what was going on. "They're trying to retroactively force you into a contract you never signed," he said. "That's not how HOAs work, Shane. Can I nail them for this?" I asked. "Oh, we're going to do better than that," Mark said. "We're gonna make their little fake kingdom crumble." So while I started clearing brush for my driveway, Mark started clearing legal brush, digging into what Tricia and her HOA crew had been doing. It didn't take long before he called me back, tone sharper this time. "They never filed correctly with the county," he said, "and they forged half the signatures on the expansion vote. Shane, this isn't just a scam, it's fraud." I looked out at the forest and shook my head. "Good," I said. "Let's burn it down." Not literally, but the paper trail. That was going up in flames. HOA story, HOA stories, Homeowners Association stories. The next move came at dawn 3 days later. I was sipping coffee on the tailgate of my truck, boots muddy from digging post holes for the new gate I was installing out front. My dog, Jasper, lifted his head and let out a low growl just before I saw the pair of reflective vests weaving through the trees. 2 men, both in their 50s, marched toward the edge of my clearing. One carried a clipboard, the other held a measuring wheel. They didn't look up until they were 30 feet from me. "You're trespassing," I said, loud enough to carry over the hum of crickets and the distant drone of chainsaws from a logging crew a few miles off. Clipboard guy didn't blink. "We're conducting an HOA inspection." I raised my cup. "On private land," he frowned like I'd just insulted his mother. "This property is under Maple Hollow jurisdiction. We have the right to ensure compliance with exterior standards." Jasper stood and padded toward them. He's half shepherd, half stubborn mule and all muscle. The guy with the wheel dropped it. "I already told your president to take a hike," I said. "You want to keep your kneecaps, I suggest you do the same." They backed off without another word. One of them muttered something under his breath about non-compliant structures as they disappeared into the woods. I called Mark as soon as they were out of sight. "They're escalating," I said. Now they're sending people onto my property. I'm already drafting a cease and desist, he said. But it gets worse. I found something. I could hear the rustle of paper on his end of the line. They filed a supplementary charter last month claiming they were granted enforcement authority by the county zoning board. The document signed by a Gavin R. Ellington, supposedly a zoning administrator. Is he real? He was, Mark said. He retired 4 years ago. I called him this morning. He never authorized any expansion, and he sure as hell didn't sign anything last month. I exhaled slowly, my coffee forgotten. So they forged a government document. Yeah, Mark said, which means we're not just dealing with civil overreach. This is criminal fraud. 2 hours later, I had a county officer parked in my driveway and a file folder waiting in his passenger seat. Officer Braddock was young, polite, and all business. He took one look at the forged document and made a sharp sound through his teeth. This isn't just fake, he said. It's sloppy. They even used the wrong county seal. While he radioed his supervisor, I handed over the footage from my trail cam's clear shots of the 2 trespassers, time-stamped. He nodded, already reaching for his notepad. We'll open a case, he said, but don't confront them. Let us handle it. I won't, I said, but I'm not taking down my gate either, he grinned. You'd be a fool if you did. By the weekend, Mark had filed a formal complaint with the county clerk, and Braddock's department had issued subpoenas for Maple Hollow's board members, Tricia included. But the real twist came when one of the HOA board members, an older guy named Don Leary, showed up on my land late Sunday afternoon, sheepishly holding a folded envelope. I didn't know it had gone this far, he said, eyes darting around like he expected someone to jump out of the woods. I thought we were just trying to protect property values. I opened the envelope. Inside was a typed letter, unsigned, threatening Don with removal from the board if he didn't support the expansion vote. Attached was a list of names residents who'd apparently voted yes. Some were dead. A few had moved away years ago. You kept this? I asked. He nodded. Figured I'd need it someday. Looks like someday's here. I handed him a pen from my truck's dash and watched him sign a statement at the bottom of the letter, confirming its authenticity. Mark was practically giddy when I delivered the documents to his office the next morning. This is gold, he said. Coercion, fraud, impersonation of a county official, trespassing. It's a buffet of bad decisions. He passed the papers to a clerk, then leaned back in his chair. They're going to implode, he said. And we're going to make sure they do it in front of the entire community. By midweek, the county's zoning board had issued a formal statement declaring the Maple Hollow expansion null and void. Local news picked it up within hours. The headline: Homeowner exposes HOA fraud with forged county documents. Tricia tried to spin it, of course. She held a meeting in the Maple Hollow Community Center and pleaded ignorance, claiming the board had been misled by a third-party consultant. Problem was, that consultant didn't exist. And her signature was on every document. The real kicker came when 2 sheriff's deputies showed up at her house with a warrant. Jasper and I watched from the hill, overlooking her cul-de-sac as they walked her out in handcuffs. By the time the sun dipped behind the pine trees, the rest of the board had resigned. Don called me that night, voice quiet. They're talking about dissolving the HOA completely, he said. Good, I told him. Start over, with real votes this time. He didn't argue. Mark filed a civil suit the next morning, not just to formally dissolve the HOA's bogus claim to my land, but to force them to cover legal fees and damages. They settled within 2 weeks. I used the money to finish the gate and install motion sensors along the tree line. No one's tried trespassing since. The land's quiet again. Jasper naps on the porch most afternoons, and I spend my days chopping wood, laying out plans for the cabin, and pretending I don't keep a copy of the forged charter pinned to my workshop wall. Not as a warning, as a trophy. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I got a knock on the door just as I was finishing up the footing layout for the cabin foundation. Jasper was already on alert, before I got within 10 feet of the door. When I opened it, there was a man in a dark gray windbreaker, badge clipped to his belt and a folder tucked under his arm. "Shane McCall?" he asked, glancing down at a thin notepad. "Who's asking?" "Detective Alan Cormer, White Pine County Sheriff's Office. Got a few questions about the HOA board you helped bring down." I stepped aside and gestured him in. Jasper gave a low, quiet huff but stayed put. Cormer didn't waste time. He opened the folder and slid a few photos onto the edge of my workbench, blurry surveillance shots, most showing Tricia stepping out of her Lexus in front of the county records office. The timestamps were from 6 weeks prior. "She entered the building at 4:42 p.m., he said. "The office closes at 4:30. No one was supposed to be inside, but we reviewed the logs." He flipped another page. This one showed a man in a navy polo swiping a keycard. "Name's Curtis Hall. He's a junior clerk in the zoning department, worked there just under a year. He let her in through the side door, claimed she was there to correct a filing error." I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. "That how the fake expansion documents ended up in the county system?" "That's our working theory," Cormer said. "Except now Curtis won't answer questions without a lawyer, and Tricia's keeping quiet." I tilted my head. "So what do you need from me?" He pulled out a signed affidavit. "You mentioned in your complaint that your lawyer confirmed the county never authorized the expansion. I need you to testify to that under oath and confirm this document is accurate. We're assembling a criminal case: fraud, abuse of public office, possibly conspiracy." I scanned the paper. Everything checked out. I signed it. Before he left, Cormer paused at the edge of the porch. "We're running a deeper audit of Maple Hollow's financials," he said. "There's a chance this thing's bigger than just your land." I nodded once. "Let me know what you find." He gave a short nod and disappeared down the drive, tires crunching on gravel. That evening I called Mark. He already knew. "They're calling it Operation Hollow Crown," he said. "The county's dragging in every board member, every contractor they paid, every permit they filed. Turns out Tricia and her crew weren't just playing expansion games. They were funneling HOA dues through shell maintenance companies and pocketing the difference." "How much?" "Preliminary estimates over $200,000. And it looks like they tried to bury a failed landscaping project by classifying it as a stormwater mitigation plan, which means they may have committed grant fraud too. County got federal funds for that one." I let that settle. "Any word on the clerk?" "Suspended. Internal investigation pending." Apparently he and Tricia went to the same country club. It's looking like she traded favors for after-hours access. The next few days were a blur. I kept building footers poured, utility trench dug, but the air around town was charged. News vans parked outside the county office. HOA members from other neighborhoods started demanding audits of their own boards. Tricia's house went dark. No lights, no movement. Rumor was she'd hired a criminal defense attorney out of Charlotte. One afternoon, I got a visit from a man named Henry Pollard, a retired federal auditor who lived 3 lots down from Maple Hollow. He brought his own thermos of coffee and a box of old HOA newsletters. "I always knew something didn't add up," he said, as we sat under the lean-to I'd thrown up next to the tool shed. "They claimed stormwater inspections in 2019, but I never saw a single contractor truck, and those reserve funds. Supposedly reallocated for emergency infrastructure. Guess what, there was no emergency." He handed me a newsletter dated just after the so-called expansion vote. It had a line buried on page 4. "Special thanks to Curtis Hall for his assistance in streamlining our records process." "They weren't even trying to hide it," I muttered. "They thought no one would look," Henry said. "Until you showed up." That night, I finally checked the online HOA forum Henry had mentioned. It had exploded. Homeowners were posting receipts, bank statements, even drone footage showing empty work sites the HOA had paid for. Henry had dropped a trove of files, including one that caught my eye, a spreadsheet labeled Vendor Payout Schedule Internal Use Only. It listed over a dozen payments to companies with names like Eastern Green Works and Pine Property Services. None had working websites. Most were registered to P.O. boxes in 3 nearby counties. I sent the file to Mark. He called within the hour. They're all paper companies. I ran a trace. One of them, Green Works, is registered to Trisha's cousin. Another to a guy who worked her campaign when she ran for town council 15 years ago. You think they'll get her on wire fraud? They're trying. But they've definitely got enough for racketeering. Counties already coordinating with the state financial crimes unit. By the following week, subpoenas were flying. 3 former board members flipped, offering testimony in exchange for immunity. One of them, a woman named Janine, admitted under oath that Trisha had been laundering money through dummy contracts since 2017. She'd even kept handwritten ledgers. Then came the bombshell. Detective Cormer called and asked me to meet him at the courthouse. When I got there, he handed me a sealed envelope. We raided a storage unit registered to Trisha's husband, he said. Inside, we found a safe. These were among the contents. I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of 2 maps, one showing the original boundaries of Maple Hollow, the other showing a drastically expanded version. But the second map had a note scrawled in pen across the top. Phase 2 expansion target parcels. Mine was circled in red. They planned to annex the entire ridge, Cormer said. You weren't just a nuisance. You were the test case. If they could force you in, they'd move on to the others. Any of those others? No. Not yet. We'll be contacting them, but your case exposed the plan. Without that, they might have pulled it off. I stared at the map, then folded it and handed it back. You keeping that for evidence? He shook his head. We've got certified copies. That one's yours. When I left the courthouse, I drove straight to the overlook above the ridge. The wind stirred the pine needles around my boots as I stood at the edge, map in hand. Below, the scattered parcels of land, some forested, some cleared, lay quiet and untouched. Free. I pinned the map to the inside wall of my tool shed that night, right next to the fake charter. Mark called the next morning with the final update. Grand jury handed down 8 indictments, he said. Trisha's facing over 20 counts. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction. Curtis Hall's taking a plea. He's going to testify against her in exchange for reduced charges. What about the other board members? 3 got probation and fines. Janine's likely walking free because of her cooperation. The rest? Well, they're lawyers shopping, I nodded slowly. And the HOA, dissolved by court order. You officially own unrestricted land. No covenants, no fees, no board. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Appreciate everything, Mark. You did the heavy lifting, he said. You just needed someone to clear the legal debris. I spent the rest of the day installing the ridge-facing windows on the cabin frame. When the sun set behind the trees, the whole place glowed amber inside. Jasper stretched out on the subfloor and let out a soft sigh, tail thumping once. I walked out to the gate and locked it behind me, the new sign swinging gently in the breeze, private property. No trespassing, no HOA, and this time it wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The first real rain of the season came hard and sudden, pelting the pine roof of the cabin with a rhythm like war drums. I was standing at the workbench inside, fitting the last window frame, when a low rumble of tires broke through the storm. Jasper's ears twitched, but he stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the driveway. A white, unmarked SUV rolled to a stop outside the gate. The driver stepped out, umbrella already opened. He wore a tailored black suit with a federal badge clipped to his belt. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, still holding the chisel. You're not from the county, I said. No, sir, he replied. Special Agent Marcus Linford, Department of Justice. May I come in? I nodded once and held the door. He shook off the rain and stepped inside, glancing around at the exposed beams and half-finished flooring. You've been busy, he said. Enough to sleep here. What's the DOJ want with a guy building his own cabin? He set a manila folder on the edge of my bench. We've opened a broader investigation into municipal corruption in the region. Your case was the match. I didn't say anything. He flipped the folder open. Inside were color photographs of bank statements, county disbursement forms, and something that made my jaw tighten, a scanned letter bearing the signature of a federal grant administrator, approving funds for a non-existent environmental remediation project. The recipient listed, Maple Hollow Community Development Trust. That trust doesn't exist, I said. Correct, Linford said. But it received $78,000 from a federal rural infrastructure grant 2 years ago. Tricia filed the paperwork using a forged EIN and a fictitious board of trustees. The money was routed through a third-party nonprofit, then withdrawn in cash over 6 months. He tapped one of the documents. We believe your property was meant to anchor a fabricated conservation easement, which she would use to apply for additional funding. Once it was under HOA control, she could claim it was being preserved under community management. So they were going to use my land to scam the federal government again. Not just yours, Linford said. 7 other parcels were targeted. You were the only one who wouldn't go along with it. I leaned back against the workbench. What happens next? We're working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to pursue charges beyond the ones already filed. Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, obstruction. We're also issuing subpoenas to several former county employees. He paused. There's one more thing. He pulled out a photo, grainy but clear enough. It showed Curtis Hall standing beside a black SUV in an alley behind the zoning office. A woman in a tan trench coat was handing him an envelope. That's not Tricia, I said. No. Her name's Eleanor Varnes. She was a consultant for a regional planning firm. She's also under investigation in 3 other counties for unrelated graft schemes. We believe she coached Tricia on how to exploit small-town zoning loopholes and grant programs. Any idea how far it goes? We're still digging, but your case cracked it open. He left the folder and his card, then disappeared into the rain as quickly as he'd arrived. Later that day, I drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, people nodded to me in that quiet, acknowledging way people do when someone's name has been in the paper more than once. Not celebrity, not sympathy, just respect. As I loaded lumber into the bed of my truck, a man in a brown flannel jacket approached. He looked about 60, wiry, with sharp eyes and a sun-leathered face. You're the guy who stood up to Maple Hollow, he said. I nodded. I've got 40 acres on the West Ridge, he said. They tried the same thing with me 5 years ago, sent letters, threatened liens. I didn't have the money to fight, so I just ignored them, figured they'd give up. They didn't. They gave up on me, but not the land. Last year I found survey markers way off the old boundary. They were planning something, I just didn't know what. You do now, I said, and handed him one of the extra copies of the DOJ letter Linford had left me. He read it, jaw tightening. Let me know if you ever need a hand up there. Back at the cabin, I finished installing the final window. By morning, the rain had cleared, and the whole ridge smelled like pine needles and wet loam. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the mist roll down the treetops like slow smoke. That week, the county council held a special public hearing. Mark and I sat near the back, watching as the remaining fragments of Maple Hollow's leadership were called to account. The room was packed, residents, reporters, even a few state officials. When Mark was called up to present the findings of our case, he didn't grandstand. He laid out the facts with surgical precision, dates, documents, signatures, and the systematic misuse of authority. He finished by holding up the original expansion map with the red circled parcels. This was not about community, he said. It was about control, deception, and greed. And the only reason it didn't succeed is because one man refused to be bullied. The room went quiet. Later, as we stepped outside, a woman from the council caught up to us. She introduced herself as Lydia Hartsfield. She ran a community nonprofit that focused on land preservation and rural development. "We want to use this case to push for reform," she said. "Not just here. We've heard from 5 other towns in the last 2 weeks that are facing similar HOA overreach." Mark arched an eyebrow. "You want Shane to be your poster child," she laughed. "Not exactly, but we'd like his help drafting a homeowner rights ordinance for the county, something with teeth, real protections." I looked at Mark. He gave a small nod. "Why not?" I said. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." Over the next month, I split my time between finishing the cabin and working with Lydia's group. We drafted the Ridgeview Homeowner Rights Act, a county ordinance that barred retroactive HOA jurisdiction, required full transparency in zoning-related filings, and established a penalty structure for board members found misusing funds. It passed unanimously. The news caught on statewide. By summer, legislators were talking about a broader bill modeled on our ordinance. Calls came in from other counties, asking for copies of the language, asking how we did it. We told them the truth. It started with one letter taped to a mailbox and ended with a law. By the time the last nail went into the cabin roof, the ridge had changed. Not just legally, but in the way people treated one another. My nearest neighbor, a retired Army medic named Rosa, dropped off seedlings for my garden. The man with the flannel from the hardware store helped me level the solar panel mounts. Someone left a tin of cinnamon bread on my porch with a note that just said, "Thank you." I never found out who. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with Jasper, watching the ridge glow gold in the late light. Mark pulled up in his truck, stepped out, and handed me a leather-bound folder. "What's this?" I asked. "Final court documents," he said. "All liens voided, all claims dissolved, title cleared. You're now the sole, uncontested owner of your property." He paused, then added, "And the Department of Justice just indicted Alina Varnes. Full-scale fraud operation going back more than a decade. You helped blow the lid off it. What happens to the others? They'll get their land back. Just like you did." He stayed for dinner, and we talked about old cases, dumb mistakes, and the time he almost got held in contempt for calling a judge's ruling a flaming pile of legislative garbage. When he left, I stood at the edge of the porch, watching the taillights disappear through the trees. That night, I finally framed the map, not the fake one, the real one, the one showing the ridge, the parcels, the old boundaries that mattered. I hung it in the front room next to the fireplace, not as a warning, as a reminder that some lines shouldn't be crossed. And if they are, someone has to stand and say, "Not here." That someone was me, and I'd do it again.